Hello fellow milliners, I'm Timothy. Welcome to my home. This was supposed to be happening at the Grove Inn, but all things considered that didn't happen. So I'm going to give you a little tutorial on making a French fashion doll hat called a Fanchon. So let's get started, and I hope you have fun. The wire that you have in your kit is directly from the coil. So the first thing you're going to have to do is to spring the wire. And you do that by pressing with the pad of your thumb against the curve of the wire to straighten it out. And the reason you do this is so that the wire won't twist when you're sewing it to the bakram. And if it twists, it'll distort the bakram and you'll have to start all over again. So now that we've sprung the wire, we can cut out the bakram pattern piece. All of the lining, the bakram, the velvet, and the baby flannel for this kit will all be this size. And these edges should be considered the salvage edge, so your straight grain is running out through the center, or in this direction. So you'll see, here's the bakram. Now the first thing you want to do is to establish a grain line, and it's pretty easy on this because it's got lines. And I use a mechanical pencil, it's a number 2. You're going to get a sharper edge to the line, and then take your pattern, which you should probably copy onto cardstock, and then just trace around it on the bakram up into the dart all the way around. It's a little light here. And you'll have a grain line on your pattern too that you can match up with the line you drew. So here it is. Now we're going to cut this out, but I don't want you to cut up into the dart at this point. We're just going to continue around the back of the Fanchon. And when we cut it out, I want you to cut it out inside the line, because every time you add something to this, it gets bigger and bigger. It's already been made to fit with a piece of wire, which is 30 gauge, around the outside edge. So you don't really want it to get any bigger than this if you're doing it for a sort of a 14.5 inch doll. So we're going to cut it out. Cut away some of that. And we're going to cut on the inside of the line. Continue around the back of the dart. Don't cut into it yet. Okay. Now, the center front of the hat, of course, if you want to mark it, is up here, which is pretty easy to remember because the dart's in the back. And this pattern isn't very difficult to keep track of. And it'll be this shape is what we're going for. So this is the piece cut out. And I want you to always be aware of the center front and the center back on your pattern. you'll be transferring those marks as you go along. And you can see this is the shape that we're looking for. But we need to round the top of the hat to fit the head. So what our next step will be is to cut through this line, that grain line that we made, up until you come to the point of the dart. And then you're going to bring the cut edges up to the pencil mark. Now you're not going to try and match the pencil marks because that'll give you a really deep peak. So we want to do it just so the cut edges match up with the pencil mark. And you're going to use a wax thread and securely sew this together. Now I like to set my first stitch by putting the needle through. Oh, it needs to be knotted first. Knot your thread. This wax, so it's a little slippery. Okay. Pull it tight so that's small as it can be. Trim off any excess. Okay, now what we're going to do is to start the first stitch is go up in between the threads where you've knotted it. Just put your needle through in between the threads. And that's a good way to start it. You don't have to put a big knot because this knot will be covered eventually. And then you just keep sewing through, sewing around. You're going to notice your thread gets dirty because of the pencil mark, but that all gets covered. So we're just going to continue to sew this, whip the stitch around. Careful, your thread's always going to catch on the buckram. And continue sewing all the way up. Just make sure that this is very secure. And it should end up looking like this. Now we're going to deal with this little point, because we don't want a pointed head. So I'll have to go to the iron for this, so we're going to take a little break, and I'll show you that step next. So the next thing to do is to take down the peak on the hat. I've flipped this inside out so that my center line is in the underside of the hat. It just helps you. And you can do this by knocking it off on the small edge of your press board, or sleeve board like this. But I like to use something rounder. So I have a bottle of Amazon by Hermes that has the perfect shaped top. And I'm going to put this over like this and then give it a little press. Now don't tell Michael that we're using steam here. Careful, don't burn yourself. Okay, that should do it. And you want this to be nice and dry, but you don't want to, before you continue working with it. See, nice little rounded head shape. Okay, back to the wiring. Now that we have our hat ready for wiring, that'll be the next step. Now, wiring this is going to be one of the fiddliest parts of making this hat, because it's very difficult to get this to curve around this little earpiece. So that'll be your major problem with this one. And I have various tools I can use. Needle nose pliers are good. But I also have these wire bending tools. And this one makes almost exact same curve as there is here on the earpiece. The only trouble with tools is that it cuts the cotton wrapping on the wire and causes it to fray, but that does get covered, so don't be too concerned about that. So you're going to start with let's continue that center line so you know where you're going. You're going to start with like about 3/8 of an inch past it, because these ends are going to overlap. Then you're going to start shaping your wire as you go along your hat edge. You can do it just with your fingers, which will give you a very nice clean curve. I'm going to show you though, if I use the tool, let's see if it'll. There, you can see it's cutting. It's a pretty good fit, but it started to cut the cotton wrapping. This needs to go in just a little bit more, and that needs to come out just a little bit more. Okay. So you can start. I think I have a little more than 3/8, but we can clip that as we come back around. And once again, we're going to set your first stitch by taking your needle up through the knotted threads to get it started. Okay. Now we're going to do a blanket stitch all the way around. You really need to keep the wire on the very edge of the buckram. You don't want it to slip underneath or on top. You need it on the very edge. Now, there's another delicate area of this buckram, which is if you get too close to the edge and pull your thread up, it'll tear out the buckram. So it's always good to go back a couple of holes, and you're going to do a blanket stitch, and you're always going to go in the back, because that really causes it to grip right into the thread covering on the wire. It's really great. If you go in through the front, you're going to get a looser. See how loose that is? And it'll continue to stay that way. It's hard to keep it tight. But if you go behind, I'm going to be daring and go right near the edge. Try not to pull too tightly. There. And you should do this rather close together. Now, when you finish and you think your hat is too, if the wire feels too loose, you can go back around it in the opposite direction, doing the same thing. And you're going to go all the way around the hat like this. And you can refine the shape of the wire as you go. And having wax thread is a big help. So you continue around the hat like this, refining the shape as you go. And if you have like little clips, you can use those to help hold your wire in place as you work through your hat, around your hat, which will help. Okay, so when you're finished, it will look like this. We've overlapped about 3/8 of an inch on the back and cut off any excess. And when you're cutting off your wire, make sure that you cut straight onto the wire, because if you cut it at an angle, you're going to get a sharp edge which will cut through the fabric of your hat. And there's nothing you can do about it once that happens. All right, now we're going to start shaping this down to give it more of a curve. And you can use something like this too. It's just a curtain rod, wooden curtain rod, which helps give you a more stable surface to press against. Okay. Make sure you have it in a good shape. And then the next step is to start fulling. Now I have no idea why it's called that, but it's what's done to pad the hat out before you put the finish cover on. So the finish cover will be perfectly smooth and beautiful. You can see right here, this back wire needs to be a little more curved. There we go. There. Okay. So the next step is the fulling, which will begin with binding the edge, the wired edge of the hat. Okay. Next step. In your kit, you will find your muslin bias strip wrapped on a little thread winder. So take that off, press it in half, and just lightly tug the fabric through under your iron as you're steaming. Now this is going to go around the hat to cover the wire, to soften that edge. So again, starting at the center back, I'm going to lay it over, and you want to cover the inside and the outside of the hat with this strip, and you want to use your folded line, pressed folded line, as a guide, because that'll go right against the edge of the wire. And I use a single thread for this. Make sure your knot is on the bottom, the inside of the hat. And with little stitches, you're going to stitch this on, keeping your stitch line close to the edge of the raw edge of the muslin strip. And you can pull and stretch the muslin as you go. Okay. Make sure at these curves that you've snugged this in as close as you can. Because you don't want to lose that shape in the final hat. Now, sometimes it helps to clip the muslin so that it will release a little bit more, just so it will stay up tight into that curve. Or you can put a little bead of glue right along there, just on the wire edge, not on the bakram. This glue is good. It doesn't wet the bakram as much as most glues. And if you wet the bakram, then you lose its stiffness and then it starts to change its shape, which is not very helpful. There, now you can see how much tighter it fits. And then just keep sewing it on all the way around. And you get to the earpiece, just fold everything up into that little section. Try to make it as neat as possible, but it doesn't really matter because it all gets covered. You're just basically trying to pad the edge to keep it from looking hard. Continue. Just going to continue sewing to go all the way around the hat. Now here's another, this curve is actually a little more acute, so the glue is helpful here as well. Okay. Continue to sew. Whoops. Got that going in the wrong direction. Okay. We get the idea. Now we're going to continue to sew this all the way around the hat. Pull the muslin, the bias, so you can get a nice smooth fit of the hat. Okay? And then it will look like this. Then the next thing I want you to do is to carefully press, steam press this all the way around the edge on something padded so that you don't do too much marking, you don't do too much damage to the shape that you've got going. Okay? Then the next step is covering it with baby flannel. So we've sewn the bias all the way around the hat, overlapping the center back, and then just give it a little press with the steam on a padded surface like this. What we're doing is trying to keep this edge as small and thin as possible. Okay. You don't want to get the bakram too wet because then it'll lose its shape again. So there. Let it dry before you start your next step, which will be covering with baby flannel to pad out the hat, okay? All right, now I've sprayed it with spray mount, which I use Scotch Super 77, which seems to work really well, okay? Take this off. And take your baby flannel that you'll find in your kit, and you're going to lay it on top of here. Actually, let's cut a little section out first. We don't need to deal with all of this. There. Okay. Lay it on. Careful of your green line. And then work it from the center to the edges so that there are no wrinkles, bumps, There. Looks pretty good. Okay. Now, you can let this dry for a little while. And then we're going to trim the excess baby flannel off. Right. I'm going to go right ahead and do that. Now, I think it's a manicure scissor because it's curved and it's kind of perfect for this. Because we have such tight little curves that it works quite well. And when you're cutting this off, you don't want to snip your bias. Be careful of that. But you want the flannel to be as close. See how nicely that fits into the curve? You can switch and go the other direction. Just be careful not to cut through the muslin. Excuse me. For spray mount, we used to use rubber cement to do this because glue is too wet and it would distort the bakram. But then your hat smells like rubber cement forever. Not forever, but you know, for quite a while. It's not always a pleasant smell. Okay, good. There we go. There we are. Next step is to cover it with the final covering fabric. I'm going to let this dry for a little bit and then we'll be right back. And now we're going to cover our Fanchon with velveteen. But first, make sure that your center marks are transferred up onto the muslin so that you know where they are as we continue through this. Now, velvet and velveteen have a nap, which means if you run your hand over it one way, it's very smooth. There's no resistance. And in the other direction, it's rough. Now, if you use the direction against the grain, against the nap, you'll get a darker color when seen from the front of the hat, which is what I like. But if you want a lighter green color, do it the other way. It doesn't matter. It's totally up to you. So we're going to cover this. Give yourself enough room. Remember the grains don't have to be 100% accurate, but it helps keep it in as close as you can to being on grain. And then we're going to start sewing this on, but you can give yourself some pins, pinning it into the flannel. To hold it for your while you start. And you always want to start from the center and move toward the outer edges. It helps you keep a smooth surface. We have threaded single green thread waxed. And we're going to sew right near the edge. This is one of the reasons you put the muslin on, because it gives you a really stable surface to sew on. You're not really sewing into the bakram, which can break away. So you're going to do this all the way around the edge. Now, this hat is going to be bound to finish off this edge, and I'm going to trim this away, but if you are so inclined, you could just take your velvet or whatever covering you're using and cover the edge with that. Your stitches are going to show through, so they have to be really uniform and very nice and small and tidy. But we're going to cover this because it gives a little more interest to the hat. Make sure you're smoothing it as you go. You should also, when you take your velveteen out of the kit, if it's got any creases or if it's rumpled from being in the package, you might want to just give it a little steam press. Don't hit the nap with the iron though, just keep the iron up off the nap as you steam it, and you can brush it. To pull up the nap if there's any wrinkles or creases. Okay. So I'm gonna go all the way around. And when I finish that, I'll be back. Okay, I finished sewing the cover on. And now I'm going to trim it away. And I knotted it on the underside of the hat so it doesn't show. Any bumps or knots up here will show under the taffeta bias binding, so we don't want that to happen. So I'm going to cut away my velvet. Close to the edge, not cutting through the bias muslin. Okay, there we go, covered. It's very pretty. Brush off some of this lint. You see what I'm using for my hat brush. It's a shaving brush, natural boar bristles, and it's small, so it's kind of nice to use for this. Loosened up a few edges here. Let's trim them away. Now, it looks pretty good. If you've crushed your velvet a lot sewing, you can give it a little steam to bring it back up, but this looks pretty good. So the next step is to cover the edges with silk taffeta. So let me get these prepared and I'll be right back. Find your green silk taffeta strip that is 7 inches long by 7 1/4 inches wide, and we're going to mark in, no, we're going to finger press, that's what I meant to say, it in half, because you want a little, faint little mark. You don't want to really press a crease in because it might show on the edge there. And now you have a little center mark on this bias. And the next thing to do is to press, fold this edge in and press it up against that crease. It's about 1/4 inch, and we're going to press that with the iron. Okay, be right back. So I pressed about 1/4 inch into that fold line that we did, that we finger pressed. And now I want you to find the center of this piece of fabric and just mark it so you know where that is, okay? Now this is going to go on the back of the hat. So you're going to match that center mark with the mark on the back of the hat. Let me pin that. Now you're gonna cover the hat completely, the edge of the hat completely. And you can use your finger press line as a guide. And you want to try and keep it the same width all the way around the hat. And then this raw edge inside will be covered by the lining later. So that just has to lay inside the hat. And just make sure it's not too rumply in there, just so that it looks nice. And then I'm going to start sewing at the center back. And these stitches are going to show, so you want to be uniform and tiny. And your knot should be underneath, on the underside of the hat, so that it doesn't show. When you sew this on, I want you to angle your needle, because what you want to do is you don't want any of your stitches to show too close to the edge. You want them to be mostly back on the inside of the hat. So angling it back, come up to the hat, catch a little of the taffeta, go back down, angling back. I don't know if you can see that. It's angled toward the inside of the hat. Okay. As you sew, you're going to have to make sure that you're keeping that inside edge smooth, and continue to sew. And you'll be stretching and pulling the taffeta bias so that it fits snugly against the edge of the hat. See, I caught just a little amount of the taffeta with the needle, and then it goes back almost in the same place that it came up. You can use your fingernail to smooth. This takes a while because you really want to be uniform with your stitches because they do show. And it's a sign of a talented seamster to be able to have absolutely equally spaced stitches. Okay. And we're going to do this all the way around the hat. And you'll see that the front edge of the hat will be bare, but we will cover that with some gathered binding. Now, when you get to the earpieces, you're just going to fold it up and catch it down with your thread. And that gets covered with your ties, so you don't have to be really crazy about it, but it's nice, you know, for your own sake to know that it's nicely finished. And on the inside, the same thing. Just make sure that it's kind of neat. Some of the lining will cover any sins, but you still want to try your best to make it as neat as possible. Okay, so this is the way it looks finished. You can see that's relatively neatly finished on the inside too. And then I gave it a light steam with the iron to just set the stitches and freshen it up a little bit. After working it, it gets a little sad. And the steam will perk it right back up. And now we're going to cover the front edge with a gathered piece of binding, which will look like this. Okay, be right back. The next thing to do is to cover the front with a piece of gathered binding. So you're going to take your 7.5 inch piece by 1.5 inches wide. You may have to trim it to that shape. That's what you'll need. And then you're going to mark 3/8 inch is in 3/8 of an inch in from the edge, one edge. And then we're going to put some gathering stitches. Fold up like 1/8 of an inch on the end. Finger press that. And then do some gathering stitches. They shouldn't be too long because you want some rather nice, fine gathers. along the line you drew, and then you'll do a second line next to it. I usually sew without my glasses on, so this is a little weird for me. Okay. Now you're going to do another row right in front of that one. Fairly close. Scant 1/8 of an inch, I would say. Okay, I'll be right back. Okay, now I'm going to do a second row of gathering stitches. Fairly close to the first one. Scant 1/8 of an inch. And then continue that all the way along the length of this strip. Now we have 2 rows of stitching, and we're going to find the center of this strip. I pinned this little turn back so that it would stay where I wanted it to. Okay. Okay, there's the center. Now, on the inside of the hat, I find it helpful to mark 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. I'm just going to eyeball it. Okay, this is going to help you with your stitching of this piece. Now take your strip with the 3/8 of an inch piece facing the front of the hat and find your center mark on the hat and on the hat and the strip, so that you've got this piece of fabric centered. Okay, you're going to pin that in place. Now this section that we turn back is going to cover the raw edge of our previous binding, and I want you to pin that in place. Make sure it's covering, because we don't want that to peek out when we're finished. And I'm going to try and keep it even with that sewn strip. Maybe a little less than 1/4 of an inch, but whatever you've finished up should be right there. Okay, so now we're going to pull our threads and gather this strip up. one side. I did knot this side so that in case I pulled too much, I'd still have something to work with. Okay, now anchor it by wrapping it around the pin. Okay, and make sure this is the same. And you're going to anchor this around the pin as well. Okay. Now you're going to work your gathers, stroke them out so that they're nice and even. And notice that I didn't pull this as tightly the first stitching row, so that's going to be tighter. There. Anchoring it again. Okay. Now you can use a pin or a needle to help distribute the gathering. Okay. Now I can see. It's very fiddly, but don't worry, it'll work out. I can see the second row needs to be tightened a little. There. Okay. You'll be glad you spent time fiddling with these gathers because it'll help you when you're sewing them. Okay, so it's going to look like this. Look pretty even. Now we're going to sew them down. So one thread knotted, waxed. I'm going to have to take my glasses off for this. So what we're going to do is we're going to start, see what happened? It moved off. There. You can make sure that those raw edges from the previous binding are covered. Okay. Now you're going to start sewing. And I'm going to match where this last binding left off. Angling back into the hat. Okay, continue sewing. Fairly small stitches. Following that 1/4 inch mark that you have on the inside of your hat. Make sure your gathers are nice and even. And you're coming up on your first row of gathering stitches. Okay, you're going to make sure that you're catching your gathers nicely as you go. Okay, I'm going to continue with this and I'll be right back. So we've knotted off to the underside of the hat. And now we can trim all of these gathering threads and sewing threads. Get them out of our way. Okay. Now we're going to trim all this little fluffy stuff. Will get trimmed away and will sort of help pad the gathers as we pull them back over the hat. So I have a little stuffing to give them lift. Okay, then you just bring this around, making sure all your little edges are covered here, the raw edge, and just check it out, see how it looks. You can see the pin has scarred the velveteen a little, but we can steam that out. So one of the things you have to be careful about with this fabric is scarring. All right, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to gather this next edge, gathering stitches. This out of the way. Okay. It doesn't have to be too close to the edge, but we'll go through this whole piece. So this is all going to go inside the hat now. Give yourself some pins if you need a little help holding it. This side. Okay, and you're just going to continue to tighten this up, and it's going to fit right inside the hat. And you're going to have a nice little edge of gathered taffeta. So I would go ahead and knot this so you're not dealing with a loose piece of fabric. Out of the way. Okay, good. Then the next thing, make sure you have nice, evenly spaced gathers. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to sew this down by going up through the hat behind our gathered stitches and then stitch in the ditch. I can get it to go through. There. You're going to do that little angle with your needle again to make sure that you're keeping them so you're coming up right behind the gathers, back down, angling away. And then keep doing that. Make sure it's close because you don't want those stitches to show. Just your gathers, you want some nice placement of gathers. Make sure these are nice too, because that's going to show a little on the underside. When you're making hats, everything is supposed to look effortless. Like, you don't ever want anything to look hammered down. It all should look like it just fell there on the hat magically. And by the grace of God stays where it is. Although there's enormous amount of actual work getting all that stuff to stay in place. And this is very difficult on this scale too, so take your time. Okay. And that just gets knotted off on the inside too. Okay, good. Now, we're going to give it a little steam. Looks pretty good. This could be a little better here. Could be a smoother transition, but it's not bad. All right, I'm going to go give it a little steam. Be right back. Okay.